Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is Monday, January 11th, 2021. Tonight's format is any question you want to propose to me as it relates to your child, therapy, mental health. I'm happy to take my best effort at answering. So please submit them at any time. Cassidy, who's moderating for me this evening, will pass those questions on to me one at a time. And we have a few questions left over from the other night. So we're going to get to those first, but you can submit questions or comments actually at any time. So let me get to the questions. First question comes in. Do the kids in wilderness write letters back to parents saying why they are mad at parents? If so, I need to go back to my son's letters. I don't recall really ever understanding why he was acting the way he was. You know, I'm going to add some commentary to this question because it might be my favorite question in terms of, in a way, my easiest question to respond to because we have a few assignments. We don't want to regulate all the letter writing back. We want some of it to be natural because not all of your conversations at home with your child are going to be supervised and facilitated by a therapist. But of all the assignments that we have, and I've said this for years now, if we could only have one assignment for your child, it would be to write an impact letter home, to write a letter about what's underneath the behaviors. Where is this coming from? What is, in a way, their symptoms and behaviors are expressions of pain, of woundedness, of fear, of insecurity, of sadness, hurt, anger, of emotions that come out sideways. And so for you all, it's not that you're the origin of all of their distress in life, right? Peers and culture and some things that are innate to the human condition and challenge, but you're the one that is positioned best to be able to start this process off. For them to describe where they're hurting, how they're hurting, and specifically as it relates to you. And through coaching and support with you, you learn to listen and you learn to kind of undo that false dichotomy that it's either they have to be accountable and responsible for their feelings or they get to talk about how they're angry and frustrated and sad with regards to you as a parent. That those don't have to be, in fact, they are not, when we think of mental health, they're not opposite. Both of those can be true at the same time. And the accountability can be implicit. So yes, I recommend to all of you, no matter what stage you're at, if you're listening, if you're watching, if you're new, if you're years after this program, is definitely leave some space for your child to be able to talk about where they're hurting, how they're angry. I was talking to my family about this in the context of our own family relationship this week, reminding them that listening is the solution. So often in our family, even if I'm expressing a frustration or somebody else is expressing a frustration or an upset, there's this idea that comes into our mind that we have to solve it, that we have to fix it, that we have to resolve it. And I was just saying just this morning to our family, I was saying that is the solution. Listening is the solution. That's all that needs to happen. And the accountability is implied by the boundaries and by the rules. You don't have to listen endlessly. You can only listen as much as you can tolerate it. But that's why we do the work, isn't it? I think one of the things that gets misunderstood also by parents is that because I put such an emphasis on seeing and listening to the child and having that be a pathway out of their suffering, out of their struggle, out of their maladaptive behaviors, because I put so much emphasis and time into talking to you all about that, I think there's this idea that sometimes gets interpreted that you have to do it endlessly. It's okay for you to set boundaries and say, this is all I can tolerate. But like I said a moment ago, the reason we do our work, among other things, one of the reasons we do our work and the outcomes of it is we can hold space, which means sit with people when they're upset and listen. That's the therapeutic jargon, holding space. That's what that means. We can hold space for the people that care about us. And so it's not that the anger is something that you feel attacked by or criticized by, and you learn to kind of dismiss your feelings, it doesn't hurt. It kind of moves through you, or you're able to just hold it lightly. So yes, um, if not you, who? Hopefully the starting point is with the therapist, right? This is what my mom and dad did. And they don't have to be right, and they don't have to justify their feelings. A lot of times when I'm talking to somebody in therapy, whether it be a child in the wilderness or a parent, when people preface their expression of feelings with, I know it's still my responsibility, or I know, and they kind of qualify, what they're doing is they're preparing the audience for the inevitable retort, for the comeback. But the healthier we are as systems, the more we can hold space while still holding accountability and owning our own limitations, our own limits, if you will. Um, the more that we're able to listen to the child express it, and it doesn't hurt. And parent after parent that I've worked with for decades now has grown in this process where they can listen to people in their lives. There's a quote that I've seen many times in social media, and kind of inspirational quotes, and it says something like, emotional maturity is getting to the point where you realize somebody's reaction or expression of feelings says more about them than it does about you. And that really is true. The more we grow, the more we improve, the more capacity we develop, we realize that, yes, there's feedback, there's opportunities to listen and to learn, but really, principally, the idea is you're just letting somebody express themselves. My therapist has told me for many years now that when she was raising her son, that people were very critical of her because she allowed her son to express at times some pretty raw emotion, anger towards her. And she says in retelling these stories, she said, who else would I want him to talk to? Who else would I want him to to share his feelings, to vent his frustration, his anger? And she gives many examples where her child was upset, angry in moments that you might be inclined to shut it down, to dismiss it, to point out that the thinking error in the child. But then she was reminded to just listen and give space for it. So it's about taking care of yourself. It's about developing capacity. It's about owning your limits. One of the mistakes that we make is we think because we have an obligation that we should be able to listen indefinitely, that we listen to the point where we start to become reactive and triggered. There are moments in my family where I think I'm ready to listen, but I find out after a few moments that I'm getting triggered and reactive. That's my cue to me that I need to take a time out, walk away until I have the capacity to listen. I had a wonderful opportunity with my family last night, with my 13-year-old and my wife, to express a dynamic. I was frustrated and upset. And I just asked them, I said, you don't have to do anything about this. Can you just listen? Are you ready for that? And my wife turned to my 13-year-old and said, it's harder than you think, Liv. And Liv said, I think I'm ready. And I expressed some sadness and frustration about something that had happened earlier. And I didn't ask for change. And they were incredibly empathic. I walked into my office to practice the guitar, and then after a little while, they said, "Hey, would you come out and share with us the new song that you just learned?" And at first, I was reluctant, but they said, "No, we really want to hear it. We're glad that you told us how you felt, and we'd like to listen. We know we've been teasing you that every new song you learn is one that we eventually get sick of. So please don't choose any of our favorite songs, but we really do want to listen, and we're happy that you're learning a new instrument." So I went back out there and we played guitar and laughed and had a great evening. So I digress, but yes, it's important throughout our lives that anybody that we're loved, that we're invested in, that we learn to listen, that we grow in such a way that we own our limitation, right? the amount that we're able to listen, but also that we are able to listen to somebody's expression of feelings and just sit with them. And that takes work and maturity and growth and confidence and strength. And that takes time and practice. So that's a long-winded answer, but please, I talk about this in the book that I'm going over right now, The Audacity to Be You. There are really two jobs in intimacy. One is to tell the truth, and one is to listen. And the listening is the real giving. Telling the truth can be scary and vulnerable because people might respond like people in your background have responded, like people tend to respond to you when you express frustration, especially when it's, or anger or sadness, especially when it's directed at them. But those are the two asks in intimacy. And I always say this, the sharing of truth, the sharing of vulnerable feelings, that gets all the press in self-help literature. And it's important. It's an important part of the equation. But I think the bigger task is to listen. Another question is, if people aren't in the business of telling you directly how you hurt them, ask yourself, are you doing something to discourage it? Really, really important. So thanks for that question. It's one of my favorites to answer and to speak on. The next question that comes in, my teen daughter is going to be seeing a therapist for the first time. How can I be sure her therapist is a good therapist if I am not the one interacting with her? What can I tell my daughter to prepare her and make sure she's in a safe environment? It's a great question. It's so hard. We at Evoke encourage you to go to therapy. I encourage everybody that I know to go to therapy. I try to teach people that you don't have to have a crisis or big problems to go to therapy, that's a myth in our culture. But the thing I don't say, that we don't say often, is you have to find a good therapist. Now, I've written about this. This is one of the chapters in the book. The last chapter that I just talked about was what to look for in a therapist. I've written a blog about it. I wrote a journal article about it with my wife. So I'm really invested in this. Part of it is, how do they feel with the therapist? Do they like the therapist? One of the mistakes that I made early in my career, and it was reinforced by many people, I think it's especially a myth in wilderness therapy or residential treatment, is if the child doesn't like the therapist, me, for example, if the child doesn't like me, then I must be doing a good job. I don't believe that anymore. I believe they can be angry at me and be frustrated with me, but I think therapy should feel good. Doesn't mean that it's painless and easy. It just means that we should feel seen. My therapist wrote a book called Seeing in Intimacy and Psychotherapy, where she talks about it. So I would talk to your child about how it feels, what goes on for them. I said to my youngest a couple of years ago when I was driving her to therapy, I said, she said, what do I talk about? We were driving to therapy. She said, what do I talk to my therapist about? I said, I have no idea, whatever you want to. I said, what I do know is if she starts giving you advice or solutions, you can tell her, I don't need advice or solutions. I already have parents. And of course, I'm making fun of myself in that process. But, and my daughter has moved through a couple of therapists. And part of it is she's been trained to recognize when therapist's agenda eclipses the client. In this case, my daughter. So ask her how she feels. Talk to her about your experience. Talk to her about what you've learned from these broadcasts. Share with her the blog that I wrote on what to look for in a therapist, or the chapter in the book that I wrote on what to look for in a therapist. If you want to look at the journal article on psychology versus therapy, just Google my name, Psychology versus Therapy, Brad Reedy, and you can read a longer article, and then you can teach her from that. But just talk to her about what it's like. And if the therapist is reactive, I've heard stories where therapists tell the child, one young person, not a child, but a young adult, at one point decided that they wanted to take a break from therapy, and the therapist said, I don't think you should do that. This is a real critical time. And immediately the client started to feel guilty and ashamed for his desire to terminate. And through some support and coaching from the good people around him, he was able not only to terminate therapy, but realize that the therapist was inadequate. That's an inappropriate response for a therapist. I hope this makes sense. This next principle makes sense. And I was taught it by my mentor, but essentially the client gives the therapist money for the therapist's time. End of deal. Then it's your hour. Then it's your hour. And as long as I feel safe and up to the job, I don't need anything else from you. And yes, I might share stories or examples or anecdotes to kind of illustrate some ideas, but the goal in therapy is to provide the client the space to become who they are, their most authentic self. And to do that, you've got to feel safe. You've got to feel welcome. You've got to feel not judged. So take what I talk about and try to have a conversation with your child about it. And the resources I just mentioned, the blog, the chapter, and the journal article are a few resources. I'm actually going to be doing a guest class for therapists soon on basically the title that I'm calling it right now is How to Do Therapy. There's also Cassie, if you could pull this up from our archive, the two podcasts I did, Cassidy, the trainings I did. One was for the ICAD conference, and one was for the Moments of Change conference. I think it was called in Salt Lake City. They're the same talk. I think they have different titles, but they're essentially the same talk. You can share those links in the chat box here, and you can also listen to that. And if your daughter's old enough, you can have her listen to it. Next question. My daughter will be transitioning home from her therapeutic boarding school in the next few months. After Evoke and 12 months at a therapeutic boarding school, she is doing incredibly well. Her therapeutic boarding school therapist said she would like to speak with the home therapist before my daughter graduates. My initial reaction is to let my daughter enter into the relationship without her therapist having any knowledge of her journey. I feel it's her story to tell, especially considering her age. Curious about your thoughts on this. I'm inclined. I don't think there's one absolute way. I think therapy at home, outpatient therapy, is a very personal process that you have to be invested in. I heard my daughter, Emma Reedy, who works for us, talking about this recently. She said, I think at some point we were talking about lying to your therapist, putting on a good face. And my daughter I think it was after a class she was attending. She's finishing her PhD in clinical psychology. And she was saying in her class, like, you have to be able to lie to your therapist. You have to have the freedom to lie to your therapist. The process of therapy is learning and feeling safe enough to start to tell the truth. But to kind of force the issue, I don't think it's necessary. I get background information on clients sometimes when I see them in private practice, but I don't need it because it's the process of creating a relationship where you can tell the truth. One definition of the therapeutic process I've heard is that some people think therapy is a place you go to hear hard things. And I think and agree with the next idea, which is therapy is more a place where you go to say hard things. That's the healing of therapy. That's what I wrote about in this chapter, that these questions are coming from. So I think you can ask your daughter about it. When I was younger, I thought like the therapeutic boarding school therapist that you're describing. To be honest with you, I would have thought the same thing. I don't think that way anymore. I don't think that way now. I would have thought it was the only way to hold them accountable to their issues, but it's a process. It's a relationship. It takes time. What would I do with that information anyway? Expose them? Confront them? Challenge them? A lot of people think that that's what good therapy is. I don't. I think the challenge is to take the risk to tell the truth about what you think and feel as the client. And the risk is that your therapist might react like people in your earlier contexts reacted, with judgments or fear or anxiety to fix, things like that. So I'm inclined to follow your inclination. That's my inclination also. And when I was younger, I thought everybody had to be accountable also. And to tell you the truth, a good therapist knows this. A good therapist knows that the client is working out their own wounding by trying to please or impress the therapist. I still do that with my therapist. Right? It's my goal just to show up and be me, but there are moments when I project onto her my childhood, my background, my relationships, and think that it's my job to convince her that I'm a great guy, a smart, talented, interesting client. That's the work. That's the work of developing a healthy self. Someone says, my son is midway in your program, and it seems that our therapist will recommend therapeutic boarding school or aftercare. How does this information get relayed to our son? I imagine it'll be shocking to him, and I imagine big feelings. Does our therapist tell him? And if so, at what point? Is there generally quite a bit of emotional distress? Thank you. It's a common part of our process. Usually it will come in a letter after you've made the decision that you want to follow that recommendation, that you write a very simple letter where you won't sell it to them. You'll just lay it out very simply and matter of fact. And then the therapist will use that letter to reinforce it. Here's my idea, and I teach this to our therapists. Tell them as soon as you can that that's the probability. And if they end up going home, not going to an aftercare setting, if they end up going home, they can easily adjust to that. But part of kind of moving the finish line out is to get them to stop focusing on the finish line, to get them to focus on the work that's here and now. So I would tell parents, like, as long as the child is not a danger to themselves, that they're not going to unravel, let's tell them, or at least hint or predict it, forecast it as soon as possible. And it happens so often in the program that everybody's going to be familiar with the process and help your child. And yes, there can be significant distress, but it's one of the first thing I learned as a wilderness therapist is how much, I always say this, the first two things I learned as a wilderness therapist is that the staff are amazing. Just an amazing caliber of people that live 8 days in a row with these struggling young people. And the second thing I learned was that children, young adults and adolescents, are stronger, much more resilient than they or their parents thought they were. So we keep them safe, we hold space, we let them go through the stages of grief. Denial, bargaining, anger, sadness, and acceptance. And of course, it's not a perfectly linear process. But yes, absolutely. Next question reads, as much as my son misses me and is mad about attending the program, I'm missing him more. But I don't want him to know about me hurting. But I have to listen to him about how he's hurting. What about me? Find people. I'm glad you're here, by the way. Let's just say that. Talk to other people about it. Mostly, I've been talking to my family about this week. It's really, really important what I'm about to say. And it's something that we're practicing is find other people outside of the family to talk to. Having a therapist for me, I said this to my wife last night, like having a therapist, having somebody to talk to is important. I can't be your everything and you can't be mine. And children can't hold our big feelings. By the way, just as a side note, I don't think it's a problem to say I'm sad and I miss you. I think that's okay. I think there's a powerful message when you say, I had my son in wilderness. If you haven't heard me share that before, my oldest, who's now 28, went when he was 13, turned 14 in the wilderness. I told him I was sad and missed him. And I think there's a powerful message when you express an intense missing but you stay committed to them being there. One of the things I learned as a father is you can have tremendous grief and loss in having your child in the program and still not doubt that they're in the right place. So I think it's okay to share that. But in general, find peers, talk to your Evoke mentor, come to the parent support group that we hold for you all, that I'll share with you those times. In fact, I'll scroll to those times. Come to the online parent support groups. We do them in major cities when there's not the pandemic, but the next one will be, January 14th at 6:30 p.m. Go to an Al-Anon group. Talk to your therapist. Talk to people. Find resources. I think one of the myth maybe? One of the myths about intimacy and relationships, especially the partner relationship, is that our spouse should be our everything. I say this in the book. I don't know which chapter it's in, but it might be in the chapter about marriage. Early in my marriage and my cell phone, when my wife called, her name in my cell phone was my everything, and I thought that was love. And I realized that's silly. That's not the way it needs to be or should be. So I changed it. Now it says my favorite other. So find people to give you support. And by the way, it's easier sometimes for mentors and peers and therapists and group members and sponsors. It's easier for them to hold space for us than it is our family members sometimes. That's okay. And I'm not saying you never try to have hard conversations, but we can't be each other's everything. Thanks for that question. Our kids, 12 and 10, are just starting to understand where their sibling is in wilderness with you. They were happy to see some photos of him, and here he is getting some support on the things that are hard for him. Do you have any suggestions on topics where they can start to write him? They are curious, but I think we all don't know where to start and to begin a new dialogue, but give him the space to try and reconnect in their own way. Ask lots of questions. They can start with questions. What do you do? What's it like? What are you learning? Let the child, this is what I love about children, young adults, and adolescent children that are in the wilderness, is let them be the experts. They're getting an immersive course in therapy and in wilderness experience. And so let them teach and talk. Read The Knight in Rusty Armor. That's a staple in our program by Robert Fisher. And it's written, it's a child's reading book. So read The Knight in Rusty Armor. That's a great allegory that kind of describes this process. But I think lots of questions. Have them ask your child in the wilderness what they should read or do, because he or she might be getting some books and some readings or some poems or some prose that he or she would want to share with the siblings. Invite them to these Q&As or have them listen to them if you think it's appropriate. Have them ask me questions. But let your child in the wilderness be the teacher. Let them be the expert. And let him do some of the teaching. Somebody writes, my daughter was just diagnosed with a high degree of diffuse psychological distress, exceptionally poor self-concept, and apparent propensity for over-reporting or exaggerating her difficulties. What does that mean? She was also diagnosed with dissociation. Can you explain that too? Those are all fancy words for she's very emotionally dysregulated, right? Histrionics is one of the technical terms, but she's very demonstrative when she feels her discomfort and distress and pain, very reactive, very unsettled. And it's so severe that dissociation is when somebody's not present. In movies and TVs, they talk about, soldiers coming back from war is kind of having hallucinations. And the only way they can show it in a movie or a TV show is to show them having scenes and playing back scenes of war and violence. from the field. It's just a metaphor for they're not present, right? So it sounds like your daughter vacillates between coping with not being present, right? Distant from her own pain and suffering and body, perhaps, to being overwhelmed by it. So those are all just fancy words for somebody that's overwhelmed. The exaggeration, again, speaking of it on a continuum, the exaggeration of circumstances, of her difficulties, most likely would be, if it were something that you could have some impact on, it would be that she doesn't feel heard. So she has to amplify the distress so people will hear her, or at least that's what she thinks will work. It's like a toddler crying and getting louder and louder and louder. When the tantrum first starts, it's moderate. But if it's not responded to or listened to, the child will scream with a kind of a rage that far out does the real situation, right? That's because they want to be heard. So the voice gets louder and louder. So sometimes I wish that the technical terms weren't used, because it's just she's overwhelmed, and she either goes to the place where she distances herself and kind of goes off, away, doesn't seem present or connected to the present moment, or to the pain, or to herself, or to you, or she has kind of a histrionic, exaggerated response. Someone writes, if seeing and listening is the way out, how do you listen when your child or young adult who is unable to communicate? He has anxiety of getting it right, not sure what words to express self, not sure how to describe feelings, experiences, not even sure how of the emotions he is having. He has a therapist, but not attachment theory based, and an ed consultant. He is a graduate of another wellness program and therapeutic school, but he is still in a problematic place, not launching into his life, tech abuse, depression, anxiety. It's a really, really, really great question. And I'm going to answer it in a way that it applies to all of you. The goal is to listen to what they are saying, even if it's through their behavior. I was just talking to my wife about this today. We were talking about a case that she's in private practice. And I was explaining how when you understand somebody, when you understand your child, when you understand your spouse or your client, you don't say what you understand to them. That's kind of like ripping off their armor or their clothes, right? That's terrifying. You act. Does this make sense? You act from a knowing place. You let that knowingness inform you. So when I teach you guys stuff, almost none of this is for your child. None of it. When I explain, interpret mental health, the intent is not for you to say any of this to your child. It's to know this, and knowing it changes you. If I were to explain a tantrum to you, you don't say to the 2-year-old, to the 4-year-old, you're tantruming to get attention, to seek connection, to communicate distress. You don't say those things to the 2 or the 4-year-old. You just know it. And knowing it gives you comfort, peace, direction. So you know your child. You create a safe place for them, and you let them come out of their cave slowly. I can't really. That's why this work we do at Evoke, when I'm talking and teaching you, I'm not telling you what to do. I can't give you a script, because that's not the thing. I give you examples of what you could say that demonstrate a knowingness. Does that make sense? I say, for example, you might say this, and it's not because I'm being tentative. It's because saying it isn't the thing. It's just what it would sound like if you operated from the place that we're discussing. So in your description of your son, he is shouting loudly about his insecurities, his lack of self, his anxiety, his fear of rejection and judgment, on and on and on. You know it. You're hearing him. And so you quiet down and you listen and you relate to him with that base of knowledge. I shared in the journey of the heroic parent that my mother-in-law asked me at one point about, she said I should teach teachers about children today. And I said, if I were to teach teachers, which I have, I've spoken for school at school districts and to class to teachers, I say I would teach them how to listen, and then the children would tell them. See, this work, my work, gives you new eyes and ears to hear what's not said. The CEO, I told this story on a podcast I was listening to. The CEO, who became very aware of himself and doing his work, went back to his business and said to the board, called the board in for a special meeting and said, I want feedback, constructive feedback, areas of weakness. I want to hear from everybody. And nobody said a word. And he said, that told me everything I needed to hear. I had not developed a culture of safety for communication, especially from the bottom up. So I'm going to try to work on that. So you're hearing your child. You really are. Move slowly. They're scared. Ripping their armor, tearing their clothes off, using x-ray vision, whatever the analogy, that's not what you want to do. That's a threat. I was talking to Travis Slagle, our very wonderful clinical director for our intensive program, who happens to be with us this evening. We were talking about this idea of resistance and about how resistance, I was taught this metaphor from my mentor. Resistance is like dealing with resistance in a client or with a child or with anybody. It's like driving a car on a frozen lake. Too much gas, you lose traction. Too much brake, you lose traction. You turn too hard to the left or to the right, you lose traction. But over time, you learn just how fast you can go, just how sharp you can turn. And you get better and better at it. So think about working with all of your children's resistance like driving a frozen car on a lake. And so sometimes when Travis and I talk about cases, we just go back to frozen lake. You know, how fast can you go? How fast is too fast? And that's what it's like in working with your specific child. That's what our job it is. My training is frozen lake driving training with human behavior, right? And I always use this analogy, and I end with this idea, like if somebody were a professional who was training on a frozen lake all the time, and they had to get from point A to point B across a frozen lake, making a couple of turns, they would get there faster than I would. 10 times out of 10. Because I don't have a lot of experience with driving on a frozen lake. The better you get at this, the better you're training, the more you can do. You know just how to drive. Those of you who have never driven in snow or ice, I live in Utah, I'm pretty good. Get somebody from California, Southern California, get them out there for their first winter. Or Travis, well, Travis has some experience with it, but moving from Hawaii to Salt Lake, and watch out. Maybe have them practice in a parking lot at first. Because you don't know until you've done it that on frozen asphalt with regular tires, you can be going 10 miles an hour and hit the brake and you can slide 50 feet. So it's that kind of practice. That's the analogy. Our next question. Our 14-year-old son is drawn to brash personalities like Trump, certain professional athletes, rap musicians, etc. We think it's partially because he knows it bothers us, his parents. It definitely could be that. You probably just touched on some of the answer in your response to the first question tonight. Any guidance on how we should manage this with him? Be curious. That's a really good guess, is that it bothers you. That's a very, very good guess. But it probably comes from a place of powerlessness. People that are attracted to personalities like that are gravitated toward these brash, powerful, sometimes bullying personalities because they identify with their strength. And they do it because they feel powerless themselves, insignificant themselves. And sometimes it can be pathological. It's called identifying with the bully, simply put. And it comes from powerlessness. So, you know, I used to talk about this in wilderness with the kids. You know, little boys and girls like dinosaurs, specifically Tyrannosaurus Rex, when I was a kid. Now I think it's some other ones like velociraptors or something else like that. But think about that. Think about T-Rex. T-Rex could squash adults. He was a devastatingly powerful predator. And that little green dinosaur that the kid has in his bed, he's identifying with the power of it, or Superman or Iron Man, right? All of those characters. You know, I used to say gangster rap music is like a T-Rex for teenagers. They feel powerless and small and insignificant, and identifying with that aggressive personality music identity gives them a sense of power. So that's the kind of usual suspect in this lineup of where, but curiosity, curiosity, curiosity. Continue to wonder. And the fact that it is a sensible an affront to your sensibilities is also a very, very good guess. With my mother, it was Elvis Presley. My mother loved Elvis Presley as a teen and young adult, and her mother hated Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was the devil come to earth, or sent by the devil himself. And it was a perfect idea for my mother to hold on to that helped her to separate from her mother. And don't we wish we could go back to it being Elvis Presley? Don't we wish? But that's not how it works. It continues to evolve. Elvis Presley wouldn't freak you out enough. Someone says, my son is still angry and defiant at almost 12 weeks in wilderness. I am doing my work, but feel discouraged. You're supposed to feel discouraged. That's the goal. I won't get into it too philosophically, but simply put, he's offering you the idea here is to detach. It is to detach. Detach from outcomes. You know, with my most stubborn and resistant clients, I would tell them at some point, thank you. You're reminding me that I can't control anybody and I have to let go. So I'm just going to do my job and I'm going to let go of whether or not you get anything out of this program. To my most resistant clients, I would have parents write letters to other members of the group or to the group, or have the group write the parent if the child was really stuck. Taking the child out of the position where they could hold the parents hostage with, because the parents are attached to something. In Buddhism, it's really similar to the idea that in Buddhism that attachment is the cause of all suffering. Not attachment like attachment theory, but attachment to things, to outcomes, to worldly possessions and comforts. So it's really the opportunity for detachment. Now, to give you some hope, I think I shared this. I talked to one of my 5 most resistant clients the other day. Of all of my 10 worst, most difficult clients, probably 6 or 7 of them I've talked to after wilderness years later because they've reached out to me for help and support with their child or their stepchild or their wife or partner. So you just never know. There's I have some respect for some of them. One of my most difficult clients I talked to within the last month about a stepchild issue. So yeah, and that's out of 1,000, more than 1,000 clients. Talking about the 10 hardest. The majority of those 10 hardest have stayed in contact and reached out. One of them sends me pictures of his family. One of them sent my child a gift when they knew that was their birthday. The next question. When a child is away for a prolonged period of time in wilderness and then at a therapeutic boarding school, how do you work to reestablish a process of trust and a bond of relationship when we are not actually seeing each other? We wonder how we will be able to rebuild a sense of trust and connection while at a prolonged distance. Fantastic question. Classic question. Start with yourself. The first ingredient in intimacy is your healthy self, your sovereign sense of yourself. Who are you? That's the first ingredient in intimacy. So the distance provides the opportunity for everybody to work on and establish a sense of self, to discover and to develop their authentic or real self. Then the coming back together is about having two healthy selves. You can only have intimacy to the extent that you have a healthy self. It's dependent on a self. If you were, like I said, if you were writing down a recipe for intimacy, the first thing you would say is take a healthy self. Take a healthy, well-developed, clear sense of yourself. In American culture, we move to togetherness, right? Often. Too quickly. That's why, for example, I haven't used this example in a long time. That's why, for example, in 12-step recovery, when somebody gets sober from alcohol or drugs, they tell them it is a common recommendation. Do not date for at least a year. And all they're saying is get yourself clear first. And a lot of people go from unclear, diffuse, reactive, codependent relationships with their parents to partners, girlfriends, boyfriends, spouses, too quickly. Spend time with yourself and figure out who you are. So yeah, that's the right trajectory. I was quoting the musical Wicked in my first book, where Elphaba, sorry if you haven't seen it, I happen to be a Broadway fan, but Elphaba was being asked by the wizard to kind of compromise who she was, to get into kind of a partnership with him, to kind of rule Oz. And Elphaba said, and I quoted it in The Journey of the Heroic Parent, she says, if this is love, it comes at much too high a cost. What she was saying is, you're asking me to give up part of myself that's fundamental to who I am, and I'd rather be alone. It's not a coincidence that's what she's talking about. These are themes for the human condition that are universal for all of us. So the prolonged separation is the first step towards intimacy. And be patient. I mean, that's the thing that comes to mind also. Be patient. Don't be in a hurry for you, for him, or she, or I'm not sure if you said son or daughter. Just be patient. Don't rush it. Take your time. The 3 circles chapter in the book where I talk about the 3 circles and I give examples where people lose a sense of themselves by entering into a relationship too quickly. I give a couple of examples in there. Take a look at that or listen to that podcast. Somebody writes, in one of your podcasts that I listened to recently, you said something that seemed to suggest that justifying your house rules or boundaries wasn't a good idea. I understand that we want to avoid arguing about boundaries, but explaining our reasons, sometimes backed up with research, seems less dictatorial. I'm hoping you could share more about your thoughts on this. It seems less dictatorial. It does. I admit that. I don't disagree, but it's trying to get them to agree. A boundary is a boundary. Convincing somebody that you're right is what we do when we don't want to set a boundary. Let's shift it from parent to child to spouse. Let's say that you're my spouse and you're an abusive alcoholic and you hit me when you get drunk. I have really two tracks to pursue. One is to try to get you to stop hitting me. I could plead, I could beg, I could threaten, right? I could tape you. I could get other people to tell you to stop. I could try to please you. I could try all of that. Or I could say, you don't have to stop drinking and you can keep being violent, but I won't be here. This is my boundary. So the idea is that we shift from being right to being a person. This is my boundary. In fact, I would say to you, I've spent the last 15 years of our marriage trying to get you to stop hitting me when you drink or to get you to stop drinking. And I'm done with that. That hasn't worked. But I'm not going to stay if it continues. And I'm leaving. And you can keep drinking if you want to. So, yeah, I understand the thinking that goes into that. It just doesn't tend to work that way. And then they end up in relationships where they think they have to prove to everybody in their relationships that they're justified. And then they're not allowed to set a boundary unless they're right. And you know right now the problem that can get people into. That is why people stay in toxic and abusive relationships as adults. Is because they're told that they're wrong, that they're crazy. But you get to a certain point in your life where your response is, I don't care if I'm wrong. I'm leaving. I'm done. And I'm just using I'm leaving and I'm done as an example of a boundary. It doesn't have to be the nuclear option of leaving. I'm just saying it's just a boundary. And if somebody wants to understand my reason and I give it, it also often leads to a debate about who's right or wrong. Then they really didn't want to know my reasoning. They wanted the first part of the debate, right? They wanted my position so they could argue against it. And a lot of our clients at Evoke live in families where we have very bright, articulate parents. And so they've been arguing over and trying to reason over something that is a never-ending cycle of debate and power struggle. Someone writes, thanks for the podcast and the books. It has been beneficial to myself and to my husband. Our DS, I don't know what that means. Has had to pass through an RTC and a therapeutic boarding school. He graduated high school early with a 3.9 and a great SAT scores, and now will be off to college in the interim. He is doing a personal gap year, I think that says. Things are going pretty well. He will turn 18 in 2 months. We realize we do not control him, only perhaps influence him. What does turning 18 mean? Additionally, what do you say when a child who says the program caused them PTSD? I'll answer the last question first. I just say I'm sorry. Tell me about it. You get to have your feelings, and maybe I was wrong, and I did the best that I could, but it could have been a mistake, and I'm really sorry. See, you're going to make mistakes, some intentional, meaning some conscious, out of anger or frustration, or you're going to make mistakes that you have no idea about and only learn about later. That is part of you being a human. In either case, it's your job to let your child feel what they feel. So if they say that we caused them PTSD, I've had clients tell me that they were hurt by my process years later. And in every case, I've just said, I'm sorry, I'm glad you're telling me. And I did make some mistakes. And in areas that I didn't think I made a mistake, I'm sorry it didn't work for you. I don't say that out loud, but if I'm thinking that, I'm sorry that it didn't work for you. You let them have their feelings. Thank them for telling you. Tell them you feel honored that they'd be willing to tell you. And then eventually you don't have to listen to it indefinitely. If it goes on and on and on, then they're not trying to tell you how they feel. They're probably trying to punish you. Right? They're exacting their pound of flesh. And you can say at any point with anybody, this is enough. I can't do this anymore. I need a timeout. I'm just gonna have to say that we're running out of time, so I have time for one more question. Oh, it's a long two-parter. The first thing, what does turning 18 mean? I don't think it means much. It's contrived. It's a social construct that, it's still a relationship. It's still what you can and can't support. Principally, the same ideas are in place. I think it's easier in some ways and harder in others, but it's essentially the same thing. And part of the point of this book that I've written is that it's the same with children and partners and friends and colleagues, and that there are more things in common with our relationships than differences. All right, I'll take this last one, Cassidy. Part one. Our 22-year-old returned from Evoke almost 3 years ago in seemingly a much better place in terms of the mental and emotional health. The gains he made were short-lived, due in part to, I believe, his going on tour with a summer music performance ensemble, making it difficult for his transition coach to work with him. He has been in ongoing cognitive behavioral therapy with an individual therapist, along with meeting his psychiatric docs for medication management. He has also been in partial hospitalization program for dialectical behavioral therapy, outpatient dialectical behavioral therapy, a short course in ketamine therapy, and even ECT. Part two, he just returned from 3 months at a residential treatment center and yet another DT program. He's also been through psychological testing 3 times, which point to a major depressive disorder with generalized anxiety disorder. Obviously, you've received an education in clinical psychology. 3 times, at which point to major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And most recently, obsessive compulsive disorder being the greatest area of concern. One of the things he said after returning from the residential treatment center was, I am more open to suicide than before. It feels as if we've just been throwing therapies against the wall to see what sticks, trying to remain hopeful, but it is becoming increasingly difficult. What should be our next steps? First and foremost, I just have empathy. You have a very atypical case, and it's just really, really, really difficult. And some problems are unsolvable. The only suggestion I would give is get support. Make sure you're in Al-Anon or CODA, or you have a really good therapist, an attachment-based therapist, so that you're getting the support that you need to be able to cope with and deal with what you're dealing with. That's my simplest advice. If you were my client, I would just work with you. I would at some point offer to talk to him if he wanted to see where, you've got to work your way through the problem. But in the meantime, make sure you're getting support for you and your life and the distress that this clearly would cause anybody in this situation. And I'm very, very, very sorry. I don't want you to be alone. I want you to find somebody. Talk to your mentor. Get a sponsor. Talk to people that can support you. That's what you need. Wish I could give you more right now. All right, I'm going to wrap it up for this evening. Both of the books, I'm going over the book, the new one, The Audacity to Be You. It's also out on audiobook narrated by me. The Journey of the Heroic Parent is also available on Amazon also. I know people aren't fans of Amazon right now, but for small authors like myself, it is a portal that we can get our small books out. I'd love to give it to any small bookstore that wants to sell it, but it's more difficult for small authors. If you would like to do your own work, your own deep dive, this is another thing that anybody, especially people that are dealing with chronic issues, to get support, attending an online intensive. Our intensive support staff are all attachment based, giving you a profound experience. One starts this week. I think it might be closed January 13th through 15th. The next one is February 10th through 12th. You can do that from the comfort of your own home. 2.5 days, less expensive, no travel expenses, safe from COVID. And then the one in February is full. The one that I'm running February 20. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is a dated one. No, that's right. February 24th through 28th is full now. So we're opening up a March one. So this slide that I'm showing you that are watching is a little bit dated. We're also doing an in-person Finding You 2 sometime later this year. So I'll get those dates corrected before the next webinar. We ask all current parents to try out 6 12-step support groups. We encourage you to try out any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Adult Children's Anonymous. Go to adultchildren.org. It's also a great one. RefugeRecovery.org and NAMI.org are also great places to get support. All of these things are free in your local area. All of these broadcasts are available on any podcast app. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy podcast on your podcast platform, Spotify also. Or you can go to soundcloud.com and listen from your computer. Or you can download the SoundCloud app on your phone and listen from there. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy podcast and subscribe there, and then notifications will come up when the new podcasts are released. You can find Evoke Therapy on Twitter and Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy, and you can find the Evoke Therapy Intensives on Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapyIntensives. Inspirational quotes, pictures, and announcements can be found on our social media sites. Also on Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives, and the blog has new content each week. All right, folks, I'll be back later this week in my continuing series of broadcasts talking about the new book, chapter by chapter. So this week, we're down to the last 2 chapters. I'll be talking about Chapter 8, Practical Tools for Being Human. It's an expansion of the 8 tools, one of our most listened to podcasts in our library. So that's January 13th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, Wednesday. Look forward to talking to you then. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your participation. For and in behalf of the people that you love and that love you, thanks for doing your work here and being willing to make your life the project. Take care, folks. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.